everyone. Hello, and welcome to another Halftime Report. I am your host and loyal servant, Wayne Hoffman, coming to you from a undisclosed location near Coeur d'Alene, and got on the interwebs. Joining us is Branden Durst, candidate for Superintendent of Public Instruction of Idaho. Good to see you again. My gosh, it's not been too long, too terribly long since you've last graced us with your presence.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to have you. Let's get right into this. I mean, and by the way, as I explained on a previous podcast with another candidate for another office, we have invited the other candidates for superintendent of public instruction to appear, and we'll hope to have them on as well. Though time is quickly passing, and the election is just around the corner. What have you? What's the big takeaway? What have you? Been learning? What are the issues that have defined the race over the last few weeks? That as you've campaigned around and have been in debates, what issue or issues does this race seem to be turning on?
I think that really I think at the highest level, this race is really coming down to just, since honestly, just two visions for for what our schools are going to look like. Um, Both of my opponents are pretty proud of their decades of experience inside the system, and they're pretty staunch defenders of that system. And I'm just coming from this from a very different perspective. I'm the outsider here. And I think that we need to get back to trusting parents. And so I think it just really at the 3,000-foot level, that's really kind of been the separation that's happened between me and the other two. But there's also been some obviously been some issues that have defined the race too, and none of them are going to be too surprising. Critical race theory, social justice indoctrination, and whether or not it's actually happening and how do we deal with that. We were on a debate on Tuesday last week with KTVB, and I was the only one that was willing to say that it was happening and that it was something that we need to address. And then we've had issues around school choice. That's another big one that's been talked about a lot. And again, I've come out, unequivocally in support of school choice, and my two opponents have either outright said no or have said only if certain conditions are met and we don't compete with public schools, and basically making the programs unworkable and really the desire to have school choice go away. So those are two of the highlights, I think, of things that have happened.
So, as you look at the critical race theory, and you say, and I've watched the debates too, and your opponents don't really seem to be terribly excited about that particular issue. Are constituents out there, are voters talking to you about that, or what's the number one concern that they are raising when you talk to them about the state of the public school system?
About critical race theory?
Yeah.
Or yeah. So I hear about it all the time. When I go talk to voters or we call them or however we make contact with them, I hear about it all the time. And so I think it is top of mind for parents. But I think the other thing that really is top of mind for a lot of voters, whether it be parents or grandparents or others that are just interested in the education system, is just looking at like, how is the system actually working or not working, and looking for somebody who is willing to provide maybe different solutions to that, looking outside of the system for ways to address some of those issues, because we've doubled down on the same approach over and over and over again, and we shouldn't be surprised that it's not working. And so I think I know that I've heard from a lot of voters that have said, look, we got to do something different. And so that's kind of what I've been seeing.
What is that something different?
Well, I think it manifests itself in a variety of different ways. Like, the first is approach, right? You can't. It's my opinion that it's hard to make the sorts of systemic and structural changes that our system needs, that our education system needs. I think it's very difficult to do that when you have become a creature of that same system, and that's just human behavior, right? You've created those relationships with within the system, and you don't want to hurt those relationships. And so, part of it, like I said, that's the approach side, where I don't have those relationships as much, and so it's not as big of an issue for me. But the other things they're talking about is just, how do we change the paradigm? So we hear a lot about teachers unions and the power dynamic that happens there with districts. And one of the reasons that I advocate for school choice is it's a way of, separating that money instead of having it just in the hands of a few school boards, having it in the hands of thousands of parents, because that will empower parents individually, which will allow the system to be more free to do what it needs to do.
Why is it that in the context of this race, um, the other two candidates, Debbie Critchfield and Sherry Ybarra, don't seem to be embracing education choice as readily as you are? Is that
Well,
because? Go ahead.
I think a lot of it comes down to who they're looking for support from. Um, on one hand, Superintendent Ybarra is playing pretty hard to the education establishment. If you watched either of the debates they had on either PBS or KTVB last week, she played up hard that she's the teacher, she's the education person. Like, this is her world, and it's probably not going to come as a surprise to you, Wayne, that some folks in the education establishment are huge fans of school choice. They feel threatened by that. And the same thing is true of Debbie, frankly. I think from my perspective, I think she's got the same concern. She's trying to play both sides of things. And so she doesn't want to get too far out on that issue because she doesn't want to alienate people that she's trying to get to support her. Whereas I just look at it and say, look, this is the right thing to do for parents. This is the right thing to do for students. And we should do it regardless of whether or not it alienates me from a group or not. It's the way we should go. So
I guess the reason that I ask is that um, when I worked on races for superintendent of public instruction in the past, choice was always a number one topic,
yeah.
and I'm wondering why in this particular year it's a sort of a question. It's now it's a debatable point in the Republican primary.
Which is strange too when you consider the fact that the Republican platform specifically calls out school choice as something that we're supposed to support. And so I think that's a reflection of just the shifting nature of who votes in Republican primaries. So, we've seen a ton of crossover voting that's happening, especially in the absentee side of things. And so I think that both my opponents are looking at how do you best attract those people to support you. And I look at it as, well, we still have a Republican platform they're supposed to support, and even if we didn't, this is the right thing to do. So,
How much of the focus has been on academic performance in the schools, and what do you think the nature of that problem is or issue is?
so there has not been nearly enough conversation about the academic performance, in my opinion. And part of that is because the superintendent, when she goes and talks to people, she likes to cherry pick a few statistics here or there that seem to imply that Idaho schools are performing very well. And the argument that I make is if you actually believe that, you should vote to reelect her. As a public school parent, that's not been my experience. And I've spoken with thousands of parents who would echo that same sentiment. But, the way we address that, I think, is a couple ways. And not to beat a dead horse, but I really believe school choice is a part of that because, you could have the best public school in the world in your backyard, but it may not still be the great fit for your student. And so you have to be able to give students the opportunity to learn in an environment that's conducive to their learning style. And when you do that, student outcomes, student achievements improve. The other piece to that is we also know that the scholarship tells us that as parents become more engaged, there's a positive relationship between parental engagement and student achievement. And so, again, going back to the school choice piece, those sorts of measures will increase student achievement by increasing parental engagement. And we have to meld those things together because they're linked together. And we know that because that's what the data tells us pretty clearly.
So when you evaluate Idaho's public school system, what data do you look at, and what is it telling you?
So I look at a few different things. I look at our IRI scores. I look at I look at go-on rates. I look at graduation rates. I look at K-3 literacy levels. There's a lot of different things. I look at the number of students that have to be, or those that choose to go on to some sort of post-secondary world, the percentage of those students that are needing remediation. I look at the amount of, I anecdotally listen to concerns that we hear from employers, especially in the career technical and some sort of trade, expressing frustration that they get students that have come out of a public system that just aren't prepared to be successful in that world. So I look at those things, and I think we need to reimagine what the system's going to look like and have it be put together in such a way that we help students achieve and be successful at whatever it is that they want to do after high school.
So, but what is the status, though, in your view, of the current education system in Idaho? I mean, is it? I've had conversations. Your friend Stephen Thane said to me that the system is mediocre. Is that the accurate characterization, or is there a different word to use for it?
I think that it's mixed. I think that by and large it's underperforming. That's the word I would use. Um, I think that there are places where it does well, but by and large it does not do nearly as well as it should. I think it's misdirected. I think it lacks leadership. Um, I think that because of its one size fits all type approach, I think that it underutilizes different skill sets with teachers and with students. So, mediocre may be a great word to use, but I would say it's definitely underperforming relative to not only its capacity, but also relative to the investment that Idaho taxpayers put into it.
So let's say you're running for re-election 4 years from now. You've been elected, and you're running for 4 year in 4 years. What metrics what's the current state of the education system to which you say, I've done the job, I've fixed some things, reelect me.
Yeah.
Let's just kind of imagine 4 years in the future, and you've gotten your way, and the policies that you've wanted have been implemented. What does it look? What does the public school system look like? How is it performing?
I think what it looks like is we've got parents that are more in control of their kids' education, number one. I think that we've reoriented the Department of Education to be more parental focused. I think we've changed the guiding principle of the department, which is focusing on student outcomes and student achievement. So the guiding question that we'll have the department is, does this improve student achievement? And anything that we're doing in the department that doesn't result in a yes to that question, we're going to eliminate. And so I think, 4 years from now, we'll be able to point to the initiatives that we've undertaken to help achieve that. We'll be able to point to the changes we've made to the department and to our policies to reorient ourselves back to those things we may have eliminated as a result of that mission change. And so I think that's what people can measure against, is to say, hey, we're trying to steer this ship in the right direction. We've got a giant cruise ship, Wayne, and it doesn't turn on a dime. So it's going to take some time for us to move it around. But I think that if we do the policies that I'm proposing, and we redirect our mission back to student achievement, which is really where it should have been all along, I think that we'll be able to be pointing in the right direction and heading back towards where we should be going.
How much should people be thinking about the Idaho standing relative to other states? And I've heard Superintendent Ybarra, I've seen her press releases. She talks about this a lot. She'll say we're 17th among the states, or I don't know what number she uses for different things. But how much is that important or not important?
I don't think it's useful just like I don't think it's useful for us to compare where we rate on per pupil spending. Those metrics I think are meaningless, because what we want is we want to create a system that helps students be successful for whatever they do after high school. And I think that's really the outcome that we have to look at. There are things, relative comparing ourselves relative to other states, and focusing on those metrics, I think is really missing the point. Because if we're doing the right things, those metrics will take care of themselves. And so really what we've done is we've allowed the tail to wag the dog. And I believe that if we focus more on where we want to get to, and we do those things, then I think that the other stuff will take care of itself, and we'll be able to actually look back and say, look at our growth. Here's a good example. We're still a member of the Smarter Balance Consortium. which is a part of Common Core. We need to get out of that. But what we need to also do is we need to replace it with a testing system that's much shorter in duration and much more frequent in interval, so we can actually measure growth as students are going through the system and make sure that they don't move on until they've mastered the content that they've gone into. And I think when we do that, when we start looking at outcomes-based learning instead of, time set spent learning, then we can actually be able to demonstrate that we have a system that works and that are actually educating kids. Because believe it or not, we have an education system to educate students, not just to spend money.
Hard to remember that sometimes. Do you think that the decision was made? And I remember when Tom Luna was superintendent, and he made an effort to, which was successful, to get every high school upperclassman in the state to take the SAT. And
Yeah.
then we started pointing out that, I mean, there are some reasons why you should be skeptical of that decision, which includes, are you just giving money to the college board for no real reason? But beyond that, now that we got one of the reasons for doing that was because the argument was that every student in the state would be tested and you'd know where they perform. And now that we know where they perform, which is not really well, the decision's been made to do away with that testing of all high school students with the
Yeah.
SAT. Is that a decision you support or oppose, or do you have a different take on it?
Well, I think that the idea that every student in the state of Idaho take the SAT is a bit flawed, to the extent that it presupposes that every student in the state of Idaho is going to go on to college, and that should be their objective, which is not true. We should be having students that go on to do other things besides college. Frankly, a vast majority of our students should be going on to do other things besides college, because it's largely not a useful investment for most families and most students, and certainly not for our government. I do think that we should make sure those tests continue to exist and they continue to be able to be accessible to students that want to take them. I support that 100%. And I do think, the PSAT is a different matter. I think I still support that being required, so that students can compare themselves to their peers and get a sense of, where they're directed. But I think that the mandatory SAT testing, I question the legitimacy of that mandate to start off with, going back to the same reason that you just mentioned. Why did we need to do it besides just padding the bank accounts of College Board? Like, what was the strategic intent of that decision? I wouldn't be opposed to re-implementing that policy, but I would need to have a better understanding as to what we're trying to accomplish when we do it.
Do you think that the standardized tests are too few, too many, just about right? I know you said there should be more ongoing, check-in points where people can check performance, but what do you think our saturation level has been on standardized tests?
Well, I think it depends. Like, when you talk about nationally normed testing, that I don't particularly think is typically very useful, because that assumes that we want students in Idaho to look like students in California, which I don't want students in Idaho to look like students in California. But I do think it's useful for us to get a sense as a state as to how our education system is performing relative to others. As far as the amount we're doing, obviously, I've already mentioned that I think the smarter balance assessments need to go away. They're basically worthless and they cost a lot of money. And so we need to get rid of those. And I do think we need to get back to a testing the system that's frankly focused on Idaho and is normed and tested to Idaho standards, and make sure that they can meet those needs. But right now, we don't have that.
So let's say a kid graduates from an Idaho high school and they go to an Idaho college, and first thing they find out is they've got to take remedial math or remedial English. And that happens. I haven't seen recent data. Maybe you have.
Yeah.
Have you seen? So last I checked, it was about 25% of students going from an Idaho school tends to need remedial classes in any of the Idaho public colleges or universities. Is that consistent with what you've seen, or is it
I
going
think
up?
I think it's a little higher than that, but yeah, that's about right.
So what should happen with those schools? And anything? Should they be punished? Should they have to pay the cost of those classes and remedial classes in colleges and universities? This has been talked about for years, but What do you think should be the case?
Well, I think that goes back to some really fundamental questions around the structure of our school system, right? You know, we reward students for sitting in a desk, not for learning. You know, you get promoted from one grade to the next because you showed up for a certain percentage of the 180 days you had to be there. And I don't think that's useful. So it goes back to this really fundamental issue of making sure that students don't move forward until they've actually mastered the content that was put before them. And that's going to mean that students are going to move along at different paces. But that's really what we need to be able to do. And it also goes back to something that I talk about, and it's a proposal that I have, which is that if students really envision themselves as post-secondary, um, advocates, or if they want to go into the post-secondary system, then we need to prepare them properly when they're going through the K-12 system to be able to be successful there. Because frankly, we shouldn't be doing any remediation in our post-secondary institutions. And so what that looks like to me is changing the way we graduate students and creating 3 separate tracks to high school graduation. And one of those tracks being a post-secondary track where we increase the amount of academic rigor, and do the sorts of things that we know that are predictive in nature, that help students be successful, so that we know when they get to post-secondary environment, they won't have to be remediated.
Before I get to, I was going to talk to you a little bit about post-secondary, before we get there, I wanted to
I have
ask
a lot of opinions about post-secondary, so go ahead.
What's that?
I said I have a lot of opinions about post-secondary.
Oh, well, good, because I don't know, we've talked enough about that, and so I want to get there. But before we get there, I remember also when I was working for Tom Luna on his campaign, and later just briefly in the superintendent's office back in 2007. There were questions about what his relationship was going to be like with the teachers union.
Yeah.
And in the early days, his feeling was maybe we can, work with them, or at least figure out a way to have a detente. What is your relationship with them?
It's not great. Um, they're not excited about a lot of my proposals, and I know that. I'm friends with several folks that work there, and we haven't talked for about 6 months, because they know where I'm at. They know where I stand on some of these issues.
The proposal in particular being education savings account, or just something else?
The ESA issue in particular is a thorn in their side. My proposal to terminate teachers that insist on trying to indoctrinate our kids, obviously they're not a fan of that either. But at the end of the day, this is not about, making nice with the teachers union. This is about doing the right thing for students and doing the right thing for parents. And if they don't want to get on board with the agenda, then that's fine. We'll write through them and get it done. Because that's what we have to do. That's what leadership's about, standing up for things that you believe in. And if they want to be able to participate in that process, if they want to be good faith actors in that, then they're welcome to participate. But if they're just going to try to distract and delay or to oppose, then we're not going to play that game. We're going to get done what we need to get done, because it's a commitment that I've made, and it's because it's the right thing to do.
There was a lot of conversation in the last few years about children's mental health, and a bunch of money has been dumped into that aspect of the education system. Social emotional learning has been also funded, which is, I think, another avenue for critical race theory. If you were a superintendent of public instruction, what would you see yourself doing on mental health and the social emotional learning stuff?
Well, first of all, we need to get rid of transformative SELs. This is just another version of CRT, right? Let's just be really clear about that. What we need to do, I think there's a couple things we could do. The first is, we underutilize our school counselors in this state. We pay them large sums of money to basically be glorified clerical staff. And I say that with having a mother that was a high school counselor in a public school for 20 plus years. And, most of these folks have clinical experience in the mental health world. And then you put them in a high school or junior high or middle school, and they don't get to utilize that. So we're paying twice, right? We're paying for these people, and then we're going into hiring social workers or whoever else. And it's incredibly wasteful. So that's number one. Number two, we need to recognize that we need to start to ask the question: is this the proper role of government? Right? Is this what government is supposed to be doing? Is this what, when our founders put Article 9, Section 1 in place, were they talking about providing mental health care to students as a part of a public education system? I don't think it was. And so we need to be aware of that too. That's not to be callous about the situation, recognize that these things are having an impact on student outcomes and student achievement. But I think we need to be really careful about the way we proceed. And I think we also need to be careful about making sure that we don't overstep our role in government and step into a lane that's supposed to be responsible, that's supposed to be in the purview of parents. Um, I see proposals that basically say ignore whether or not a parent wants their child to be seen by a counselor or a psychologist. And that really concerns me, because ultimately that's a decision that a parent should be making as to whether or not their child's seeking treatment, whether it be physical or health or mental health. That should be within the purview of that parent to make that decision for their child.
Okay, I want to get to. I want to spend some time on colleges and universities. Before I get there, I'm sorry. I just thought a couple more things I wanted to visit on with
Okay.
the K-12 system. Uh, Sorry for not thinking of these things earlier. But in the past, candidates for superintendent have been asked about their support of the education system through things such as lowering the supermajority for building of schools. And I've seen candidates for the legislature once again be asked that question again across the state. And of course, you've been in the legislature. So, what is your position? Would you be supportive? I know you don't cast a vote if you're in the superintendent's office, but you could indicate your position. Would you support or oppose lowering the supermajority to build new schools?
No, and in fact, I think they need to be moved to elections to November elections in general election years, even numbered years. I think they need to be done that way. And the reason is because this is a burden that's being placed upon the entire school district, not just on the few people that decide to show up in an oddly timed election. And so I think we need to move that to a general election in an even numbered year and make those decisions where most of the voters have a chance to participate.
You would run for the Boise School District Board as well at one
Yeah,
time.
I
Do
did.
you think the 3 mil M&O levy is still appropriate?
No, no. In fact, when I ran that position, I knew I wasn't going to win. People don't. Oh yeah, you're right. You did. But no, I really did. I knew I wasn't going to win, and that's not why I ran. I ran to be able to see where the landmines were, because politically landmines exist, and when you run for something that that obscure, sometimes those things present themselves, and it gives you the opportunity to address them then instead of when you're actually doing something important. So, but no, in fact, I actually think I would love to see this Boise School District taken over by a new board that's willing to eliminate that from their charter. Because as you know, Wayne, that's why they still can collect the M&O levy, is because they are a charter district, which allowed them to kind of get around the change that happened in 2006. So I think that would be really helpful. And in fact, it doesn't help the district any, because they just continue to pay more money. And ultimately, if these things are actually needing to be paid for, then it should be a state obligation. So the fact that we're taxing people
Districts,
twice.
yeah. It's the schools. The school system is supposed to be uniform, except for in the case of when they get a special tax levy, in which case then they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, and you look at this. This is what I think is curious. We had a $1.9 billion surplus last legislative session, right? So don't tell me we didn't have the money to take care of it at the state level. We had the money there. We chose not to, and so we're going to continue to double tax people. So not only people are paying for income tax and sales tax, now they're being asked to pay more property tax to just grow more government, and I think that's a mistake.
One of the things that the superintendent does is propose a budget to the legislature for the public school system.
Yeah.
Let's say that you've been elected. What things would you put in or take out of the budget that you would propose to the legislature?
So I got asked that question at a City Club of Idaho Falls debate,
Oh,
and the moderator said the way that the question was asked was, as state superintendent, it's your responsibility to advocate for more money for public schools. That's exactly the way the question was asked. And I said, no, it's not. I said, my job's not to ask for more money. My job's to get results. And so, people could expect that of a budget for me, for us to really change the dynamic and change the conversation. Because this is not a matter of just dumping more and more money into a system. That's not working.
Right. That's why I asked the question: what things would you add or take out? Because there must be
Yeah.
there. Maybe you don't have a desire to add anything really to it. But maybe you also have something that you'd want to remove from the current public schools budget.
So what I want to do is one of the very first things that I want to do when I get into that position is I want to do an audit of our department, and I want it to not just be a financial audit, but I want it to be a performance audit as well. So we have a sense of what kind of things are being done in our department, what things are duplicative, what things are necessary, what things aren't necessary, so we can start to trim it. I've made the commitment that my department budget will be smaller when I get done than it was when I started. That's a commitment I've made. As far as the total K-12 budget, I think there's a few things we need to be doing with that too. And one of it comes down to just the way that we fund our schools. The funding formula for the state of Idaho is quite antiquated. It's complicated. Nobody understands it. We need to change that. It needs to be much more, it needs to be driven by enrollment, not driven by these other sorts of things like support units and average daily attendance and salary-based apportionment, those things that don't really make any sense. We need to have it be enrollment driven. And then we need to give districts the ability to spend the money the way they want to instead of telling them how they have to spend it. Because when you tell somebody they have to spend X amount of money on something they don't need, they're still going to spend the money, and that's just wasteful. And so I think that we'll be able to slow the growth of that process if we give districts more discretion. And then when you add the element of competition through an ESA, I think that'll also help drop that curve down so we become more efficient with our use of our funds.
Okay, I think I've covered all the things I wanted to do on K through 12. I could probably ask a billion more questions, but I want to make sure we get college and universities in here because the Superintendent of Public Instruction does serve on the State Board of Education as an ex officio officer. What do you? Well, let me just throw this right out at you. You've been very critical of the college and university system. You've been critical of the social justice and critical race theory stuff going on campus. Your opponents have they indicated that they? Well, I don't want to talk about what they think. Let's just talk about what you think. Um,
We can just infer what they think is the opposite of what I think.
we'll just stipulate that's true. Would you have an effort to fire the presidents of the universities that have been responsible for the implementation of some of this stuff on campus?
Yeah, I think what we need to do, one of the proposals that I have, I don't get a chance to talk about this very often because people don't ask, but I look at the system of higher education, not just here in Idaho, but just nationally. And I look at places like Berkeley or Evergreen State College, institutions that have they're infamous for their liberal bias, right? And I look at those systems and I say, why is it that we're allowed to have a public university, which obviously means it's supported by taxpayer money, that has that sort of, ultra leftist perspective, but we're not allowed to have a university that has a conservative persuasion? Why is that the case? We don't have a single example in the entire country of a public four-year university that has a conservative tilt to it. Not one. You could maybe say Texas A&M a little bit, but even still, there's a lot of that institution that isn't that way. And so my argument is we need to get rid of the leadership at Boise State, which is going to be hilarious because I actually walk across the stage on Saturday again for an ed specialist degree, and I'll be looking at Marlene Trump thinking, I'd like to end your job. But the point is we need to replace her with someone who has a conservative perspective, and we need to transform Boise State into a conservative thought leader in this country and become the first public university in the whole country that has that conservative perspective. I think doing that, you start at the top, because in higher education, it's very hierarchical. It's very top-down driven. And so you start at the top, then they hire new deans that are able to reflect that same perspective. You hire new, department chairs, you hire new staff, new tenured faculty, and then we can actually transform that institution. And then those sorts of things that you talk about, social justice indoctrinations, those things go away because the leadership isn't there to support it. When I met Marlene Trump before she was hired, I was actually, because I had my master's degree from Boise State, I was invited to participate in some events to meet candidates for the presidency at Boise State, kind of in a unique way. And when I met her, I thought, wow, she's really great. She's going to be a great administrator in California, because I could just tell there was no cultural alignment with Idaho. And when she got hired, I thought this is a huge mistake. And the more we've learned about her, and she's a great lady. She wants to do what she wants to do. We don't have the same vision. We don't have the same cultural values. But, you know, at the end of the day, the more we've learned, the more we realize how misaligned she is with Idaho values. And we need to find somebody who's going to be able to do that.
Do you have the same feeling about University of Idaho?
Yeah, I
Or
think the
Idaho State
doctor is in
University?
the same place. It's a little harder because Idaho has the land grant, and that kind of creates a few dynamics that are different. But I think that Dr. Green is just as culpable in that same thing. And I think it goes back to when the legislature makes the sort of policy proclamations that it has, whether it be through a policy change or through some sort of legislative intent language, through its budgeting process. You know, the State Board of Education should support that decision from the legislature, not actively work to undermine it, which is what's happened in the last year and a half. We should be holding their feet to the fire. We should be asking them if they're doing things to support Idaho's values, if they're working empathetically to those values. And I think that's what's unfortunate. The latter is what's happened in the last, several years. So,
Do you think that the superintendent has any chance of having any influence on that aspect of the role on the Board of Education? One vote next, well, actually, next ex officio position. It seems not that your role is somewhat limited.
well, you still get a vote, right? Even though they're ex officio, they're still voting members. Um, but here's what I think. I think, and this goes to a really, fundamental issue that I see currently in Idaho is just education leadership ecosystem. We elect a statewide education leader in the state superintendent, and then we really give a lot of the authority to make those decisions to an unelected set of appointed board members. And so one of the things that I'm an advocate for, and something actually I'm going to push for as a state board member and as a state superintendent, is to have the state board elected by a region. There's 7 unelected members right now. There's 35 legislative districts. And so I think, even if you use Common Core math, 7 goes into 35, 7 goes into 35, 5 times, and you just have these districts that go in, and we can get for every 5 districts, you're going to have a state board member. So districts 1 through 5, would have a member. Districts 6 through 10 would have a member, and so forth. So that way we have guaranteed geographic diversity, but we also have some accountability to voters in the decisions that they're making.
I'm also wondering about the role of the governor's office in this whole equation, because I'm not sure when it exactly took place. It seemed like back in the Kempthorne years, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, the governor decided to add an education policy advisor, and that tradition's been kind of carried on throughout the Otter administration, now in the Little administration. What's the role in the interaction between the superintendent's office and the governor's office that you'd like to see?
Well, it's been different, right? Oftentimes, the governor and the superintendent has subjugated themselves to the governor's office. And that's not what will happen. I don't care who's elected governor. That's not how it's going to work with me. I'm equally elected. I'm also a constitutional officer. The governor is not, doesn't oversee me. They don't get to decide what I do and what I don't do. If the governor does something that I think is opposite of what I would do, I'm going to make sure that is made known. And to the extent that the governor's office wants to support my vision for public schools, recognizing that I'm the education leader in the state, and that's great. And to the extent that they want to lock horns, then I'm ready to do that too, because you are given the subject matter expertise as the state superintendent, and I think that you need to recognize that you have this constitutional authority to do that.
There's been also a lot of interesting discussion over the last, and I'm back in K-12 again because I don't want to leave without getting this. The legislature did pass a bill last legislative session that sort of reauthorized this grant program for parents and students to take advantage of some outside school resources. They can't use it for private tuition, but they can use it to maybe hire a tutor or buy some books or computer programs. What did you think of that program? Go far enough, not too far? Was it just a way to avoid doing an ESA? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. It's a way of trying to stop having a hard conversation. And look, I respect Senator Dentartog and Representative Foreman's effort on that legislation, but it really was it's pretty much a know nothing bill. It's a way of trying to avoid a harder conversation, and I think that's the problem. Great parents are going to get to have the opportunity to be able to have their kids do some sort of extracurricular things or tutoring. I'm supportive of that, but I think it's really missing the point where we really need to have money follow students. We don't need to create a whole nother government program. That's really where I have the problem, because that's what we've done. We've just created more government, and yeah, it's a grant program, but it's still taxpayer money that's funding that, and it's debted taxpayer money. So
there's a great deal of money that comes from the federal government for education as a percentage of the total education budget. It's not as big as, say, healthcare programs like Medicaid, but it's what is it, about 10%, 15% of the state K through 12 budget. How much is an appropriate amount of money from the federal government? Would you be inclined to, if you could, get rid of all the federal money that's going into the K through 12 system?
I think by and large, the answer to that question is yes. I can understand and make an argument for title programs, because their rules and regulations related to them are clear. They're targeted to specific students, and we know what they mean. We know what they are. But the things that are outside of the title programs, I believe we need to get rid of. In fact, I was at a meeting a couple weeks ago with Congressman Fulcher, and he and I were having a conversation. And I said, Russ, when I'm the state superintendent, one of the very first things I'm going to do is I'm going to ask your office, because he's on the education committee in the U.S. Congress. I'm going to ask your committee to put together a list of all the federal funds and the streams of those funds coming into Idaho. And I want to know the exact rules and regulations, the strings that come with every one of those dollars. And then we can look at those things. We can take them around the state of Idaho, make sure people understand these are the strings that are tying us down. And then we can start to get rid of those things, because I think we've really crossed a line in Idaho where we become too reliant on those funds when we don't need to. Again, we had a $1.9 billion surplus. We don't need the federal money. And so I think we need to eliminate those things. I think we need to get rid of those federal strings so that we can educate students the way that we want to in Idaho, without the concern of what the federal government may or may not tell us to do.
I also want to ask you about the land board, because has anyone talked to you about the land? I don't think that did the land board come up in the debate at all.
I've got lots of opinions about that too, but we don't ever get asked about the land board.
It just seemed as if that kind of fell to the wayside this time around. What would you do differently from the incumbent on the land board?
So number one, I think we need to be much more strategic about how we integrate federal lands, especially forest lands, into Idaho controlled forest lands. And so I think we need to leverage the good neighbor authority much more. I think we need to go in, we need to create a plan where we create zones within the state of Idaho within our national forests, and we work with the federal government to be able to clean out the underbrush and reduce the density of the stands in those things, with the goal towards having state control of those lands once the liability is eliminated. Because right now we wouldn't really want to take over those lands, the federal lands, because if we did, we're just asking to take over this huge federal liability that's it's a tinderbox waiting to just explode. And I don't think that would be wise for Idaho taxpayers. But if once we got those things under control, then things would be okay. As far as there's another thing that we can look at mining permits, for example. The average length of time it takes to get a mining permit right now is 15 years. That's ridiculous. And so I think the land board needs to work more intentionally to try to help streamline that process, to create a rebuttable presumption for those permits to be approved, and so that we can get around. We're depending upon who's in the administration federally, the rules the EPA creates are going to continue can make those permits more difficult to get or easier to get. I think we need to get off that crazy train. We just need to set the policy for the state of Idaho that says this is what we're going to do, and start having some clear directives to make sure that we can access some of these resources in a safe and environmental focused way. Then we will also help be able to have more input in the state of Idaho.
Hang on a second. I got to do something about this. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Mine
One
hasn't
more. One more for you. And I forgot what it was. It was really good. Boy, don't you hate when that happens? I was distracted, and now I can't get to my last question. Oh well. What other closing thoughts do you have, Branden? I'll try to think of what it was I was going to ask.
Well, I feel like right now the race is pretty simple for voters. We're being supported by the vast majority of conservative groups in the state, and we've got a lot of support from folks. And I think that folks just need to look at who's supporting who. One of my opponents, who's raised over $250,000, is being supported by the Idaho 97 project. She's on their sample voter guide, and so Republicans should look at that and say, why is it that Idaho 97 thinks that somebody who's running as a Republican is the right person to run our schools? Because that should terrify you, right?
What's the answer to that question? Do you know?
What question?
Why Idaho 97 is supporting her?
Because they know that she'll do what they want her to do. Because she's not going to come in and disrupt the system. She's going to continue to try to dump more money into the system, not reform the system, and that's what they want. They don't want somebody. In fact, they've actually under that same endorsement, they've flagged me as a scary guy, because they've said we absolutely can't have Durst win this election, because if he does, he's gonna screw everything up. And I'm like, that's right, I am, because that's why I'm running. Because if I thought things were going well, I wouldn't have wasted the last 15 months of my life, spent all this time away from my family, and done the things that I've had to do, the sacrifices I've had to make. If I thought things were going great, I would have just stayed home and done the things that I do at home. So this is a big change. So we need to do something about it.
Has anyone asked you your opinion of the education initiative that's supposed to make it to the ballot in November?
Yeah, Nate Shellman asked me about that today, actually, when I was on his radio program. I think it's dumb. It's a waste of time. It really goes to show that people don't understand how the appropriations process works in the state of Idaho, right? Okay, let's just say, for hypothetically, this initiative passes, right? They can't obligate the legislature to spend that much more money on public ed. What they've done is they've said, okay, we're going to pass this, and then the legislature is going to backfill that with something else and put it into another program. So they're not going to be any further ahead. They're just going to tax people more. And if that was really their objective, then I guess they've succeeded. But if their objective was to increase K-12 spending, there's no way to obligate the legislature to do that. That's not how it works. That's not how the budgeting process works in Idaho or anywhere, as far as I know. So, they can increase $250 million in K-12 spending, and the legislature is going to take that out from the bottom, and we're going to be at the same place we already were.
Yeah, I also kind of wondered if this was a way to repent a little bit for what they did in the Medicaid expansion in 2018, because we told them back then that was going to take money out of the education system, and lo and behold, it has. It's actually cost more money than was anticipated in 2018, and by a factor of, what is it, 3 or 4, I think. There's a pretty significant delta between what they said and what it's amounted to. So. A huge expense, and if you think the money should be going to public schools, it can't now.
Yeah, right. And this initiative doesn't help things any. I mean, it taxes more, but what's going to stop the legislature from then is using that $250 million and giving it someplace else back to taxpayers, right? Like, it's a shell game. it's something that they can use for messaging, but it's really not going to have any impact at the end of the day on either public school funding or anything else.
Okay, been close to an hour. Anything else you want to add before we go?
I don't think so. I appreciate you taking time to ask me some questions, Wayne, and we're excited. If people want to learn more about the campaign, they can visit the website durstfrido.com or call me at 208-505-8893. That's my personal phone number. People can call me directly. I give that out everywhere I go. So,
Do you get a lot of people taking you up on that? They call you randomly, not knowing who you are?
I get some trolls call me at the middle of the night. They think that's hilarious. But by and large, people don't. But some people do, and they actually have questions, and they appreciate the fact that they can call me. And I think public service is actually about serving people. And so, if you're not available to be reached, if you have to go through a gatekeeper to talk to your public servant, then I don't think you're actually willing to actually serve people, because you don't want to have to listen to their concerns. People are going to call and complain to me about stuff. That's totally fine. Like, I didn't sign up for this to be a cakewalk. I want it to be hard. I want people to ask me the tough questions, because that's why I'm here.
All right, Branden. Good talking with you again. I'm sure we'll see you around on the campaign trail. And it's Election Day, May 17th. So it's coming to a close really, really fast. So now's a chance to get to know the candidates and figure out where they are on different issues. All right. Thanks so much. Good talking with you.
You too.
See you later. Bye-bye.